So I've been asked to bring the psychological perspective to this seminar on MAUM. And so to do that, I'm kind of going to treat this like a Psych 101 class on some level, okay? So one of the things that we do in the field when we are doing like that introductory course is, of course, we have to define the discipline, right? And so we know that low G is study of, right? And so study of what? Psyche. And we define that in psychology as mental processes and behavior. Now, what's really important around that is that word scientific also that's in front of it. So the definition is important, but the word scientific is also important. Because what that means then is that we measure that which we, well, let me back up. We speak only to that which we can measure. And that's extremely important. It's important because that means what separates psychology from philosophy is the fact that we do experimentation. So our chosen methods of experimentation is extremely important. So if we can only look at that which we can measure, that means that we end up limiting the human being. Right? We limit them to physical matter and in the material world. And this limitation then kind of sets us up to say, well, does MAUM really exist within psychology? Right? So as I know psychology, and I've probably studied it for a little over 40 years at this point, right? I don't know a concept such as MAUM or like MAUM in psychology, okay? Traditional Western psychology. But fortunate for me, as a graduate student, I was able to look at other wellsprings of psychology. I was able to understand that there are other cosmologies, other worldviews, other philosophies out there. And part of what I had to do as a student was to take a course called People of Color and Mental Health. That was the name of it. And so that kind of pushed me into an arena where I began looking at those cosmologies and philosophies that are out there. And in particular, the one that I studied most, and I'm going to bring to you, come from our ancient ancestors. And so I'm going to look from African-centered psychology, and I'm going to pull on a clinical psychologist by the name of Naim Akbar. I'm going to pull on some of his work. And so part of what I want us to look at is this word, psychology, origin, as well as its definition. So what we look at is in the context of Kemet. And so that's an ancient name for the landmass that we currently refer to as Egypt. Right? But you'll hear me say Kemet throughout the presentation because the philosophy that I'm pulling on comes from that time period that it was called Kemet. Okay? And so Ki was one of the words and it meant soul. Su was another word and it meant she. So the Greeks quite often came over and studied in what people today may refer to as the Egyptian mystery systems. Some of you may have heard that terminology before. And so that was the educational system. And the belief was that in learning this, you could learn who you are. So what they took from Kemet in terms of translating to their language was the word psyche. Okay, and you'll see the relationship not only in somewhat in the spelling, but also in the meaning. So psyche was associated with a female goddess, Su, she, right? And it meant soul, Ki. Now, that's kind of like psychology in terms of you see the word psyche in there, and so then you think, okay, psychology. But the problem is psychology, remember I said it's scientific. So we only can study that which we can measure, and the soul belongs to another discipline, okay? And we are extremely territorial in the academy, okay? And so you can't step in other people's fields, okay? So go back to the definition. We can't say it's the study of the soul. We have to replace soul with mental processes and behavior. Okay? So again, we're talking about this limitation. But we're not going to move in that direction, because I told you we're going to drink from another well. We're going to move in the direction in terms of looking at the philosophy of those from Kemet. And so they moved into the word saku, okay? Oh, I better not be too close to this. So, so saku can be defined as the understanding, the illuminator, the eye and soul of being that which inspires. Okay? So there's a philosophy that I want to present here, because psychology is anchored in philosophy. Okay? If you're familiar with that fact. In fact, the field itself grew out of departments of philosophy. Okay? So we have to have a philosophy to anchor what we're going to do this in. So another thing that I want to bring out of ancient Kemet is man, know thyself. Right? And it's inscribed in many of the pyramids there. And it's like a dictum. The saints, study your mind. Everything is within. I mean, on some level, you know, I feel like the last two presenters just did my presentation. But, okay, and this is the beauty of MAUM Buddhism and Master Soto-san, that the truths that exist in all religions fundamentally are the same. Okay, so we're about to hear the same thing over again, but in different words. Okay, so what that dictate said to us is that we need to know who we truly are. Who we truly are. We need to know the divine energy within us. So what I have listed on the top, again, talking about this Kemetic philosophy, are what they call the dimensions of the soul, that's how it's translated, or the psychic nature. And I want to pull out actually just one of them, because I got 20 minutes, okay? And so I want to talk about just one of them, and that's the Aku. And I want to talk about Aku because it's seen as the seat of intelligence and mental perception, Aku. Okay? And so the Aku is to guide us while we're here in this physical world, while we're here in these physical bodies. It's in charge of like mental processes, like reflection, analysis, judgment, those kinds of things. But what's most important is that it exists to serve the higher being. So it can't go off and just do its own thing. That's not how it's supposed to be. Okay? It's supposed to serve the higher being. What in Buddhism we might call the Buddha nature, as was mentioned earlier, the true nature, different terminologies that we might use. It is also where there is a resolution of dualities. Right? Dualities such as like our cognitive processes that's involved in reasoning, but then also ethics. And so ethics become really important. In fact, we talk about a yoking, bringing together reasoning and ethics. And sometimes when we talk about Aku, people talk about what's called the thinking heart. Sounding like MAUM, right? Sounding the same. So I wanted to share this one, it's really, the folks of Kemet called it the Meduna chair. The Greeks named it hieroglyphs, okay? But if you can see, it's a little big, but a little small. I'm only going to explain the scale part. So at the time of death, in the mummification process, you know, the brain was unimportant, right? There was like a little instrument they just stick up your nose and pull the brain out and throw that out. But the heart, they maintained, right? And the heart was used in terms of judgment. And it had to be weighed. So on one side of the scale, look kind of reddish looking, there's the heart. And on the other side is a feather. And so if you reach enlightenment, your heart would be light, lighter than a feather. Okay? So again, what we're looking at is how important it is. And of course, when we're talking about the heart, we're talking about the brain. On some level, these are forms and they're metaphors for what we're trying to get at. But we have to communicate, so we use these metaphors, right? So how do we take some of this philosophy, right, and distill it into psychological theory? Okay, so I kind of want to turn to that at this point. So one of the things that I think becomes important to talk about in this MAUM conference, as we're talking about things like trauma, we're talking about things like addiction and other mental, what we would call in psychology, disorders, right? I want to talk about will. And on some level, will can be seen as a unique aspect of human beings. Like people say, we have free will. We get to make choices, decisions. And I do believe this is where the essential work is to be done. Will, we have choices, we have intentions with whatever it is that we do. I don't know, maybe people want to call it a superpower. That's the terminology people like to use now. What's our superpower? Okay, but what I believe also that's really is important is that mental disorder is the result of being out of order, out of alignment. And so what we end up doing when the higher being is not the guide, as we talked about in Akun, we end up functioning, maybe willy-nilly functioning, as opposed to truly being masters of ourselves. And so part of what we have to learn is, how do we develop this mastery of ourselves? How do we bring the lower self in alignment with the higher being? The Buddha nature, the true nature. How do we remember, put back together, bring out really who we are? Like education is that process by which we educe, bring out what is already in us. So when we go back and we say, man, know thyself, it's because everything is already in us. And what we have to do, as was already spoken about, is like clear away some of those cobwebs and let our true nature shine and lead the way. I believe that involves study and practice. I've learned over the years, I'm like a perpetual student. Right? The closest I could get to remaining a student was to become a professor. When I completed my PhD program, I actually signed up for another PhD program. Okay? And my undergrad professor said, no, it's time for you to go get a job. Okay? So I've been slow with the practice. And in fact, I couldn't even conceive of it. I didn't know it. I knew a lot of the philosophy, but I didn't know how important practice was. What I thought I knew was only the tip of the iceberg of what could be known without practice. And so once I began to practice, now what I was studying made more sense. And then what I was studying enhanced my practice, which enhanced what I was studying. So, okay, I'm not going to go back and forth, okay? And so ultimately, study and practice, they go together. But in psychology and for psychologists in this arena, we may have some challenges, okay? And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on talking about the challenges, but I'll say ethics is definitely a big challenge. We have ethics in psychology, but the ethics are about how you conduct research with animals and how you conduct research with humans. They're about how you do therapy with people, but we don't have ethics for people. Okay? So then when you're talking about your clients coming in, there's not like an ethical system to work with for your clients. So I think that could be a challenge for us. Although a paradigm shift is occurring, okay? So who knows? But right now, as I understand things. The other thing I think that can be quite challenging is the study and practice part. There's a training that you have to go through to ultimately be awarded your PhD to be a psychologist. So if we're going to study and practice, and as we're moving into these arenas that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail, are we as psychologists engaged in proper study and practice in order to do the things that we need to do? So as we're talking about using these spiritual modalities, are we practicing them? Because I'm not certain how do you guide your clients in that if you have not experienced it. And particularly in relation to what I talked about in terms of study and practice. You know, I had to get my driver's license at some point, and you know, I studied that book like it was a textbook. And I went and I was mad that I got one wrong. Okay, maybe it was an ego thing. Okay. But guess what? I got my permit, but did I know how to drive? Oh no. No. It takes more than just a permit. So it takes more than just study. Practice is an important component of this. So if we're going to develop and continue to use therapeutic techniques that fall along the spiritual domains, we have to think about that and how we're going to proceed with it. So ultimately, I'm suggesting that we need to continue in that vein, developing therapeutic techniques that look at will training, that look at mind study. Part of what I'm suggesting is that, okay, yes, folks are talking about mindfulness. Folks are talking about seated meditation. Folks are talking about compassion. Those are terms you can find now within the context of psychology. I still would not call it the main part of Western psychology. You know, I spent most of my career teaching introduction to psychology. And some of that terminology is not found there. And when it is found there, it is very little, and it's usually around stress. And then the research that's done, and this is the scary part, although we can like some of the research, you know, when you get in someone else's boat, they're steering it. And so right now we may say, oh, meditation is absolutely wonderful, and we have research to support it. But what's going to happen as we move forward, and it's already happening, people are going to start going through that research with a fine-tooth comb. And what's the flavor of today may not be the flavor tomorrow. Because as we look at that research, many times people don't really understand seated meditation. They don't understand mindfulness. They're not measuring it properly. And so what will happen as we move forward is that people will say, there's a problem with the research. It doesn't really work the way we've been thinking it works. And I've seen this happen, you know, as I said, teaching for a number of years. I've gone through so many editions, some of the intro textbooks maybe at the 13th edition. And that means they keep pulling things and putting things back and pulling things and okay? You know, so this is where I go back to that study and practice and why it's so important. Personally, as was already talked about, threefold study I found works for me very, very well. And I think that it can be very helpful in the development of will. You know, it's already been explained. But I will say as a psychologist, again, that could be a challenge. Because we're taught to study other people's minds, not our own mind. In addition, we're taught that if I study my own mind, I'm not being objective. Somebody else needs to study my mind. But what we know, if we've engaged in these processes, we have to study our own minds. We're the ones that understand our intent. We have to develop our will. And I think the 8 articles would be helpful in that too. We need a fire, we need some ignition to get us going, some fuel. I'll just mention the ones for development, and that's belief, zeal, questioning, and dedication. Those are extremely important. Oh, my time is up. Okay, so will that is tamed, will that is trained, is the path, I believe, to mental order, possibly even enlightenment. And I'm just going to steal one more minute of your time, because I have to bring this away just from looking at people who are diagnosed, which is a small portion of the population, and people who come into therapy, which could be an even smaller portion. Because what we're talking about is world transformation. And so when we're looking at these things, we're all suffering from mental disorder. We all need to get our minds in order, which means we all need to engage in mind study. We all need to engage in will training. We all need to ultimately engage in the mind study practices and to cultivate Akun and MAUM. And once we do that, what we will learn is that we are touching the entire world, not just ourselves. We go inward, as was said, to go outward. But that's the duality that disappears then. There is no inward, outward. It's all one. And oneness is extremely important. This final thing that I'd like to say to really help us to understand oneness is that it is important to study our minds, but what's also an extremely important part of Buddhism and why Buddhism is service. And so we go inward, but we also serve. But what we learn is that we're not, even though in the beginning you might think I'm helping someone else, and then later you might think in helping someone else I'm helping myself. But then even later, you'll recognize that just as my left hand can save my right hand, and I don't think it's in service, you're not serving anyone. Because we're all one. So, Kamsahamnida.